Welcome to the Election Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Findlay, and we are brought to you today by the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We're joined by Maine Representative Laurel Libby. Representative Libby, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, I am excited about our podcast today. We have got a lot of very interesting topics to dive into, a lot of fun topics, I would say, depending on your perspective. I'm going to enjoy the conversation at least. Before we dive into that, Representative Libby, tell us a little bit about your background, how you got involved in politics and your interest in election integrity.
Sure. Well, until 6 years ago, I didn't really have an interest in politics. I was a nurse and a mom, small business owner, but I read the news one day and I woke up to what was going on in our state, and it was a very different Maine from the state where I was born and raised. So I got active grassroots with the grassroots, and then realized I probably needed to be on the inside to make change. So I campaigned against a two-term Democrat incumbent. Thanks to the grassroots, we were triumphant. We flipped that seat, and I'm now serving my third term in the Maine legislature. And of course, election integrity is critical. We see that around the country. And in Maine, the legislature has failed to pass voter ID, despite the fact it's clearly the will of the people. And so we have advanced a citizens initiative so that Maine people could put voter ID on the ballot, and will now be voting on it this November.
Well, and so voter ID is not just the will of the people in Maine. Right. There are a lot of groups out there that have done polling on voter ID, and it polls at least 80% across the board, no matter Republican, Democrat, no matter what the partisan breakdown is on this. What is the pushback to this in Maine, and what do you think the odds are of getting it passed?
That's a great point. I think we'll be the 37th state when voter ID passes. And it does cross party lines. So I want to be really specific here. Even Democrats in Maine want to see voter ID passed. It is specifically Augusta Democrats, those in our capital in elected office, that do not want to see voter ID as law in Maine. In fact, one of their Democrat operatives has said on the record that if voter ID passes and you have to verify your ID, they will lose 13,000 votes. Now, that seems like a pretty powerful motivator for those in power in Augusta, hanging on to the majority by 60 votes to avoid passing voter ID. So it's the Maine people who will now have the opportunity to do what Augusta Democrats refuse to do.
Well, and I read that quote. He said 13,000 Democrat votes, right? That's the part that we've got to emphasize. He said we're going to lose 13,000 Democrat votes, which show this is clearly a partisan thing. Now, this citizen initiative is not without controversy, though. I know you've gone to the court over this. Tell us a little bit about what that lawsuit's about, and then I've got some things to read about this here.
Sure. Let me back up a little bit and just give you some context. So when we say this is a citizens initiative, it truly is a grassroots effort. About 800 volunteers collected 170,000 signatures plus, which is more than twice the number needed to get it on the ballot. And so that's why when I say it's the will of the people, it's very clearly a mandate, frankly, from Maine people. So once this was put on the ballot, then it's the Secretary of State's job to draft the question. And our Secretary of State, some folks may know her name, it's Shenna Bellows. And this is the same Secretary of State who worked to keep Donald Trump off the ballot in Maine unsuccessfully last year. So we are working with a very partisan Secretary of State who drafted the longest question in Maine history, 66 words. And nowhere in the question does it actually say voter ID. That piece of it is buried towards the end of the question, and it's a little bit vague. And so it's going to be hard for folks who haven't been educated on it to know what they're voting on because of this weaponized question that our Secretary of State has drafted. So we did take the Secretary of State to court. We challenged the question. It went to the Maine Supreme Court. And unfortunately, they have allowed that the Secretary of State can write the question as she sees fit, essentially giving the nod to weaponizing not just this question, but further questions in the future, which I think is a really scary precedent to set, but here we are. And this will be the question on the ballot. Early voting starts today. This will be on the question on the ballot for November 4th.
Well, and I want to read this question just because I think it'll be interesting for our listeners. I've got it pulled up here. Listen to how long this is and tell me how confusing this sounds.
Try to do it in one breath.
Well, I'm not even sure if I can, but I will. Do you want to change Maine election laws to eliminate 2 days of absentee voting, prohibit requests for absentee ballots by phone or family members, and ongoing absentee voter status for seniors and people with disabilities, ban prepaid postage on absentee ballot return envelopes, limit the number of drop boxes, require voters to show certain photo ID before voting, and make other changes to our elections? Clearly, that language is written to obscure what the whole provision is about.
Mm-hmm.
But the courts have upheld this. What kind of education campaign do you have to do to get this right in people's minds?
Well, the main thrust of it is that is the question, but their campaign is focusing on the absentee ballot part. And that's where the absolute lying comes into play. The opposition on this initiative is saying basically that we are canceling absentee voting, which couldn't be further from the truth. And so our education mainly centers around that absentee voting is still absolutely intact. Folks can request an absentee ballot online, via snail mail, or in person, just as they've been able to for a long, long time. They will not be able to request one by phone, however, because we couldn't verify ID that way. So the other mechanisms allow for verification of ID so that folks, whether they're voting in person or absentee, they will be required to show proof of ID.
Well, and I think it's so important just to emphasize there, why should absentee voting have different identification rules than voting in person or by mail? I mean, that provision about the phone just seems so logical.
Mm-hmm. It is, and yet it's the piece that the opposition is using to say that absentee voting will be no more. It will disintegrate, and it couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, and I understand also that the thing that the left always talks about here is not everybody has a voter ID. It's hard to get a voter ID, whatever it is. I mean, this also requires the Secretary of State's office to make non-driver's license voter IDs available to people, right?
Yes, correct. We already have a state of Maine ID that's not a driver's license that will be available to anyone and everyone to ensure that they have a photo ID free of charge. If folks cannot afford an ID, it will be provided for them. And I think that is a really good use of taxpayer dollars. I am a fiscal conservative, but I think this fills a need so that there's no more objection to say that folks can't afford an ID, and so this is a bad idea. No, this is a great idea. It's a common sense policy that the majority of states already have. And so by ensuring that everyone who needs an ID can have one, it can do away with that objection.
Well, it seems like everything's covered here. We've just got to get the language right on that and get people's minds right so that they vote the right way on this thing.
Yeah, for sure. And, that absentee provision is really important because 40% or so of Mainers do vote via absentee. And so if we simply require ID for in-person voting, that's a huge portion of the voting block that would not be required to show ID.
Well, that's right. That's incredible. One of the most interesting things, and this is going to lead us into our next topic, one of the most interesting things that I think has happened since really the 2020 election with COVID is how many people are voting by mail these days. It used to be that absentee ballot was something that you had to be out of the country for or, request because of a need. But 40% of Mainers are voting by absentee ballot these days. Got to put an ID requirement in place.
Yeah, for sure. And at the same time, absentee voting in Maine is open to everyone. So the folks overseas or who want to vote absentee for any reason can. In fact, I voted today myself in person down at City Hall. I like to have Election Day freed up for visiting various polls and making sure volunteers are all squared away. And so I vote on the first day that is available. And early voting started today. So I was at City Hall, voted, got my sticker, and folks will still be able to do that for any reason whatsoever.
I love it. I love it. That's a great message. Well, let's flip gears a little bit and talk about something that is going to be near and dear to listeners of this podcast. We've been talking a lot about the weaknesses of mail-in voting this year. A lot of the reason of that is because of President Trump's comments about mail-in voting. But in Maine, you've had a very big current event happen regarding some ballots that got mailed, didn't you?
We sure have. Last Wednesday, the news broke that a woman in a small town here in Maine had gone out to bring in her Amazon delivery and noticed that the box looked a little funny, like it had been cut open and then retaped. So she took a picture of it right away, proceeded to open her Amazon delivery, and found that in addition to her rice, lightsaber, and paper goods, there were 250 official Maine ballots, shrink wrapped 50 at a time, 5 packages of these ballots in her Amazon delivery. She promptly turned them over to the town office. And now, unfortunately, they are in the hands of our Secretary of State, who is investigating herself on this matter. We are hopeful that at some point a federal investigation will ensue, because I think that's what we need for the transparency, for folks to be able to trust the security of their election.
Well, and I know this is new, right? So there's a lot that we don't know about this situation so far. But in doing some research, I know that the Maine Secretary of State contracts with a vendor to create these ballots. It's ES&S. A lot of people that election and pay attention to election integrity are probably familiar with. The chain of custody on these ballots should be that the ballots are printed at ES&S. They are sent securely to the town offices, to distribute the ballots, and that should be the chain of custody. Do we have any idea how these would have ended up at an Amazon distribution center in the first place?
There has been a complete lack of clarity on that or any of the other questions that I think are so pertinent to this situation. The Secretary of State has said that she is investigating it, and that's really as far as she's gone. We have no other information as to how these possibly could have gotten into an Amazon delivery. If they are, in fact, part of that allotment that was ordered by the Secretary of State from ES&S. And so today, with early voting starting, we know that the city halls are required, the town halls are required to have their allotment delivered by the state. And so no one has heard if there is a town hall that is missing 250 ballots, or if this is an extra allotment that has somehow cropped up from who knows where. So there is a tremendous lack of clarity, no transparency or accountability, and a lot of questions yet to be answered.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there's 250, let's maybe say extra wrongly delivered ballots out there, that they ended up at an Amazon facility, that they ended up at somebody's home, right? Now, I've done some calling, and I'm fairly familiar with Maine, and I know that y'all run elections up there by township, which can be pretty small. And I even had someone who has run Maine township elections before say, these townships are really small. Sometimes things will get delivered to people's houses, right? But is it customary for official, ballots, things like this, to be delivered to a residence?
It's not customary. I do know that in a rural state like Maine, what I have heard is that there are some towns that get delivered to a residence. Now, I don't have verification on that, but what is clear is that these ballots were delivered to a Newburgh residence that they should not have been. For sure. She took those ballots to the Newburgh Town Hall, which is where they should have been delivered to, and they certainly shouldn't have been in an Amazon package. One of the questions that I have certainly is, are there only 250 extraneous ballots? Are there 500? Are there 1,000? Are there other Amazon packages that have official Maine ballots in them? And so, again, these are all questions that Voter ID for Me has posed to the Secretary of State with, of course, no answers back at this point.
Well, and the Secretary of State's always one to say that these are the Maine runs perfectly secure elections, right? But there are 250 ballots out there floating around. I think the other thing to kind of highlight about this is we're talking about the weaknesses of mail-in voting generally. The topics that we're talking about today could all be prevented if we reduced the size of mail-in voting, right? From voter ID, right? Voter ID is not an issue if you have to show up to a polling place, show your ID, and cast a ballot. And we all know that there are exceptions, that some people can't make it to a polling place. But,
Sure.
Mail-in voting greatly increases the need for voter ID. And then, random ballots getting mailed out. If you had to show up at a place to vote, or or to deposit your ballot, maybe there would be less security around these ballots getting just randomly delivered to a house.
Well, that is the logical conclusion here, isn't it? Regardless of where these ballots came from, if they're part of the official allotment, if it's an extra printing, how they got in an Amazon box, the answer to all of these questions at the end of the day is we need to secure our elections, and a piece of that is passing voter ID. So 250 extra ballots, or however many, let's pass voter ID. It is absolutely, I would say, the best example for why it's so critical and why Maine should be the 37th state to jump on board with this common sense policy.
Well, that's exactly right. And that brings us to the last topic that we want to touch on really quick here, and that's the Department of Justice request for Maine's voter rolls. Maine has refused to provide those voter rolls. I don't think that's surprising given our conversation today, but what are your concerns about the voter rolls in Maine, and why would they be refusing to give those to the Department of Justice?
You know, taking a deep dive into the mind of Secretary of State Shannon Bellows is a place I don't really want to go. However, I can't think of a single legitimate reason to not turn over the voter rolls, which leads me to all kinds of questions for why then can't we hand over the voter rolls? You know, anecdotally, of course, as a candidate, when you're canvassing door to door, and actually in my other day job of doing some real estate staging, I would always make note of all of the addresses where you might have 4 or 6 folks registered, but the current folks who are actually residing at the residence and voting there, up to date folks that are registered appropriately. You have these extraneous folks all over the place, right? People who used to live at one address and then moved on, but are still registered there. And so they may be registered in several places. Our voter rolls absolutely need to be cleaned. I was talking with a friend just the other day who lived in Maine, was registered here, and then moved to another state, moved to a third state, and then back to Maine, and found that they were registered in all 3 states. So that all brings me back to the same question. What legitimate reason could there be to not hand over our voter rolls to the DOJ?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the DOJ is asking for the voter rolls and what you're doing to clean them. Just so everybody knows, I believe Secretary Bellows' response was to tell President Trump to go jump in the Gulf of Maine.
That is accurate. Very, very pithy and inappropriate, but that's par for the course here in Maine.
That's right. Well, and it also tells you that there's probably something she doesn't want people to see in there.
Correct.
Representative Libby, you've been incredibly generous with your time. What is your final message to tell people to get this voter ID across the finish line? What do we need to do here?
The bottom line is that Yes on One will ensure that voter ID is required for both in-person and absentee voting. It will secure our elections. And so it's critically important that folks look beyond all of the shenanigans and vote Yes on One in the polling booth.
And we have listeners in Maine, but we also have listeners across the country. What can they do to find out more or to support you in your efforts?
Well, they can find us on Facebook, Voter ID for Me, and they can also visit our website, voteridforme.com. And if you want to learn more specifically about the Bellows ballots, you can do so at voteridforme.com/Bellows.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Libby.
Thank you.
This is Josh Finlay with the Election Protection Podcast. Like, follow, and subscribe. You can find us on YouTube. Thanks for joining us.